Howard Rheingold. I assign texts on the history and origins of the public sphere to students in both my digital journalism and virtual community classes for the reason that I think the single most important question we can ask about the meaning of the internet is whether or not democracy's future is healthier or not because of the democratization of the ability to communicate and publish. The term public sphere refers to that two-way flow of information in a democracy that enables citizens to have some reasonable idea of the workings of the state, a notion that's sometimes called transparency, and that enables citizens, if they are able to organize and to understand the issues of the day and to communicate about it, to influence the policies of the state. A general force known as public opinion. The phrase the public sphere is most widely associated with the German political philosopher Jürgen Habermas, and because Habermas writes in the way that a very serious philosopher does, his work has not been widely disseminated among the people who are interested in the future of the internet and among journalists, although I'm sure that anyone who is thinking about how democracy is going to fare in the internet age, and every journalist understands the particular role of communication media in somehow balancing the citizens and the state. The reason we go to the history of the public sphere, going back to the English Civil Wars and the petitioners who made use of the new availability of print, is that the period we're in today is really a transitional period. Just as in the 16th and 17th century, print literacy was changing the way in which people communicated and the way in which people received information about the state. The internet is only a decade or 2 decades old in regard to its spread among the world's population, and institutions are evolving. I think among internet enthusiasts there's been a polarization between the kind of utopian ideas of electronic democracy and the very opposite, the notion that the ability of everyone to contribute has just entered so much noise into the system that really, although publishing and communication has been democratized, the public sphere has been degraded. There's also the notion that as newspapers, as the primary way in which information about the state and public opinion emerged in early democracies, as those institutions, as the businesses that support newspapers are facing problems, in fact, may become extinct, there's a real worry about, again, a kind of polarized idea of the mainstream media versus bloggers in their pajamas. I think in both cases it helps to look at the history, because the public sphere was not so much invented as evolved. You talk about the mainstream media and bloggers in their pajamas today, you might well have been speaking about the uneducated, vulgar petitioners in the days of the English Civil War, and the more refined aristocratic classes. In both cases, the literacies that emerged from a new medium, a new technology, began to spread, and people armed with those literacies were able to invent new forms of collective action. And I think that what we're seeing today, with the emergence of blogs and wikis, of YouTube, and many other ways in which citizens can contribute information, misinformation, and disinformation, is the beginning of an evolution. So Habermas, as I noted, was a political philosopher, and there's been an entire school of discussion and critique of his work, most notably Nancy Fraser critiquing the idea of a bourgeois public sphere that's confined largely to bourgeois, to middle-class white men, and introduces the idea of publics. I'm interested in the history because recently a historian by the name of David Zaret has written a book on the origins of democratic culture, in which he said, in effect, it's too bad that the whole philosophy of the public sphere stems from the work of a political philosopher whose work is largely cerebral, certainly based on historical evidence, but not empirical in the way that historians' work is. And Zaret said, in effect, if Habermas had the tools of a historian, he might have looked at source documents and found that instead of the Enlightenment philosophers who gathered in the coffee shops of London and Paris and Amsterdam and Philadelphia in the 18th century, that in fact a far less aristocratic, more vulgar, less educated population of the various religious factions, the religious dissidents in England who were intimately connected with English politics, because of course if there was a Catholic or a Protestant on the throne and they changed sides a couple of times, then the people who dissented from that reigning theology were in trouble. So it was really literally a life or death matter to talk about theological issues during this period. And of course, there really wasn't what we call transparency. You could be hanged for revealing what was said in Parliament. And of course, the state did not have to answer to the public. There was really no influence of public opinion on the state. Somehow or another, over a period of a century or two, that situation changed, and we now have parliaments making policy rather than monarchies, and presumably publics who influence policy. Now, of course, in the early 20th century, Walter Lippmann questioned whether in America, the country he was living in and writing about, the citizens are qualified, are educated enough to make the decisions necessary for governing a complex democracy. The American public, in Lippmann's terms, were sheep, were easily misled. And of course, famously, John Dewey responded in his review in the New Republic and later writings that, in effect, if our citizens are ignorant and easily misled, then perhaps we need better institutions for informing them. We need better journalism, and we need to educate them. We need a better public education system. So this issue of whether and how citizens can communicate with the state and know something about the state is something that's been a live debate for quite some time. And I think that today, as we're looking at the impact of internet technologies, the emergence of many-to-many communications, whereas the printing press was really a broadcast medium in which a few people who had access to printing presses were able to influence and persuade many. We now have an age in which, for better and for worse, every desktop connected to the internet can influence and persuade. Are we going to emerge from that cacophony with some kind of coherent way of conveying the workings of the state without too much overt manipulation by the state and by powerful interested actors? And are we going to see the emergence of new forms of public opinion formation that can influence policy? I think that there are strong signs that would enable you to argue either way today. Certainly, the science of manipulating public opinion is much more sophisticated and much more well funded today than it was in the time of Walter Lippmann. And certainly, we've seen with the Howard Dean campaign and then the Barack Obama campaign the ways in which citizen media and grassroots, sometimes called netroots, communications and advertising, have been able to merge with the kind of top-down political factions like the political parties that vie for the seat of power. So I think if you read Zaret and see how petitioners and the different factions in Parliament in England who were vying for power began to appeal to each other by saying that they had the backing of various factions of unpowerful people through these pamphlets, petitions, and beginnings of newspapers. They were appealing to what became public opinion. Zaret also points out that the criticism of news media today, whether it's the mainstream media or the bloggers in their pajamas, reflects some of the same criticism that was leveled at the origins of the public sphere. The idea today is that the news media, being in many cases wholly owned by entertainment companies, are vulgar, commercial, and sensationalistic. He points out that this was true as well of the original newspapers that evolved into what many considered to be the fundamental communication medium of democracy. So Paul Sappho, the future forecaster, has often said that you ought to look twice as far backwards as you're trying to look forwards if you're trying to forecast something. And I think if we're going to forecast the future of the public sphere, we need to look at the way the current public sphere originally evolved over the last couple of centuries.